I mentioned last week that the writer of 1 Peter claims that the suffering of Christians that arise directly from faithfully following Jesus is nothing less than our participation in the ongoing story of Jesus. That might seem like an odd concept, even pretentious. Yet we find the same idea in the writings of Paul and in the Gospels. Indeed, Jesus, as he commissions his 12 disciples for a mission trip, warns them to expect suffering simply for following him. That reality is one reason why we need to be grounded in who we are and to know with a passion the continuing story of God of which we are a part. Our reading today explores those connections to multiple Old Testament images, not least as a means to rally the troops and to help them feel less isolated in their sufferings. It's never a bad thing to pause and reflect on our connectedness with the worldwide church, both in the present and throughout history, and to remember that God is working his purpose out as year succeeds to year. Let's hear what the writer of 1 Peter has to say. At the end of chapter 1, he reminds his readers that the word of the Lord endures forever. He's quoting from Isaiah 40, and that theme is repeated in Isaiah 55, where God says, "My word goes out from my mouth and will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it." The writer of 1 Peter says, "And this is the word that was preached to you." In other words, God will keep his promises, and it's therefore implied that your present sufferings will not be in vain. He continues, "Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good." He uses this metaphor of a newborn baby to connect with his earlier reference to being born again. This image of milk being given to babies was commonly used to mean the elementary teachings to be given to new converts. In this case, the living and abiding Word of God is both a gift and a grace, and it's through that God will transform his people into a worshipping community, those who recognize God's ways and who have tasted and seen that the Lord is gracious, as the psalmist puts it. Moving forward, this time with a different metaphor, the writer takes the word Lord to mean Jesus rather than God, saying, "Come to him, to that living stone. Yes, humans rejected him, but God chose him and values him very highly." Let's pause for a moment and consider stones, for they can tell a story. Consider the diamond in an engagement ring. It's a symbol of promise, commitment, and faithfulness. As you look at such a ring, it contains a precious story of hope and confidence for the future. Stones can therefore evoke memories. Let me give you further examples. I have a rock here, and this was given to me from good friends from the northeast of England where I used to live. And this was taken from the local beach as a tangible reminder of our walks and talks together. And I have another rock from our family vacation last summer. And this was from the Canadian Rockies, and it was taken from the bed of a retreating glacier. It's a geological reminder of our planet's story. Stones were significant in the Old Testament too. Here's just one example. When Joshua led the nation of Israel into the Promised Land, they miraculously crossed the River Jordan on dry ground, just as they did when they left Egypt through the Red Sea. Once over, God told Joshua to send 12 men, one from each tribe, and send them back into the center of the still dry riverbed and gather 12 stones to serve as a reminder to the people for the years to come of what God has done. The risen Jesus is the living stone, the witness to God's ongoing salvation of his people. I'm told that there's some Hebrew wordplay here, as the word for stone is very much like the word for sun. As the writer says, humans rejected him then, and they still do, but the resurrection reveals that God has vindicated Jesus, the precious chosen Son, to all who have tasted and seen that Christ is gracious. But the writer develops that metaphor further by saying that his readers are also living stones. Just as Jesus is alive and life-giving, so are we. That is our identity too, because God is graciously at work in you and me. We too may be rejected by people for identifying ourselves as followers of Jesus. But the point here is that we too have been chosen by God and are precious and honored in his sight. God is building a spiritual house with these living stones. The static temple in Jerusalem is no longer relevant. In other words, we are being incorporated into a new community. This allusion to the temple causes the writer to think of priests. We living stones are all to be mediators between people and God. We're called to live lives of holiness, faithfulness, and mutual love. Ministers, then, are not that special. What God has begun in Jesus the Messiah, God is continuing to accomplish through you and me. This mention of precious stones and the sun moves the writer to speak of Jesus as the cornerstone, and he cites Isaiah 28, verse 16. The cornerstone, as the name implies, is chosen for its 90-degree angle and is set at the corner of two intersecting walls. Today they are often ceremonial, engraved with a date and perhaps the name of the builder or the architect, but it signifies the stable basis for the construction of the whole building. Since the cornerstone is Jesus, it is he, in essence, who determines the building's shape and design. We living stones are therefore placed in reference to him. The writer then introduces several pairs of polar opposites to stress his point, namely honor and shame, choose and reject, belief and unbelief. The readers of 1 Peter were described as resident aliens, and they may well feel shame now, but as living stones chosen by God, they, like Jesus, are precious and honored. Those who believe recognize Christ as being honored, but those who don't reject the cornerstone as the reference stone for the building of their lives. This willful rejection is mentioned in Psalm 118, verse 22, and tripping over this discarded stone is alluded to in Isaiah 8, verse 14. The writer is therefore reminding his readers, including us, that God's story of which we are a part extends back into the Old Testament. Put another way, the New Testament is a continuation of God's rescue of his people, and we need the Old Testament to make sense of the New. Before moving on, it's worth remembering that people back then didn't worship God in churches, but in people's homes or in a secluded place outside. So this metaphor must not be equated to establishing a physical building to worship God. Sacred spaces have value and are a visible sign of the faithfulness of God. But maintaining the church building, though important, is not our primary calling. We're to be living stones, not static ones. How we live our lives of holiness, faithfulness, and mutual love is our primary witness to the wider community of God's presence and grace in our lives. The writer reaches a climax in his affirmation of his readers, using even more Old Testament imagery. He says, "You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people of his own, so that you may proclaim the virtues of the one who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." Let's unpack this briefly. The mention of a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and a people of God's possession all allude to God's deliverance of his people from bondage in Egypt, as we heard in our Old Testament reading. And of course, these titles, along with being a chosen race, refer to the Jews. They were God's chosen people. The original readers of 1 Peter were non-Jews, and so now they are implicitly being included in God's own people through the death and resurrection of Jesus. That's good news. God's grace is not restricted to ethnicity. However, mention of being chosen trips many people up, not least in the Presbyterian Church and its traditional doctrine of predestination. For the writer of 1 Peter, belief and unbelief are the two responses to Christ. Those who believe are God's chosen, and those who don't are stumbling in the darkness. Don't be offended here, because enlightened worldly wisdom says the very opposite. It's Jesus and his followers who are rejected and humiliated. One could put it this way: faith and unfaith are matters of human choice, but the consequence of faith and unfaith have been predetermined. Given the writer's use of polar opposites, and he uses them as a linguistic device to make his point, let's not stumble here over predestination and free will. And let's be reassured by the words from 1 Timothy, which proclaim that God desires all people to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. Being chosen by God, then, isn't a matter of pride, but of grace. For it is God who has called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. And there's two more polar opposites. But the grace and mercy that we have received is, as the writer puts it, to proclaim the virtuous deeds of Jesus the Messiah. It's not a private gift, but a public one, since through us living stones, God extends his love and grace to others. How everyone responds is not really our problem, for as Jesus tells us himself in the parable of the sower, everyone will respond differently. What is our problem as a church is our faithfulness in proclamation and action. In conclusion, in hard times, we need to know who we are, our identity, our story, and without that, we're lost in the darkness. For many, our identity is wrapped up in our work, and in this crisis, whether because people have been laid off or through lack of routine, we have lost a sense of who we are. Moreover, as a culture, we have lost our story. As Christians, we're part of God's story, not one that we have written ourselves. It's a story that reaches back to Moses, to the psalmist, and to the prophets. And if we truly grasp that, along with the Easter message, we will regain our story and hence our identity. We will become living stones that are connected with a community of Jesus followers, present and past, who are all aligned with reference to the cornerstone, Jesus himself. The writer of 1 Peter summarizes his passionate speech with an allusion to Hosea. You once were not a people, but now you are God's people and have experienced his grace. That being the case, let's live life fearlessly on that foundation. And why not mark this moment by selecting a special stone and keep it as a witness and as a reminder of what God has done and is doing even in this time of crisis. Amen. Our next song is 10,000 Reasons. Whatever we're facing, we have many reasons to proclaim God's goodness and to worship his holy name.